Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included Jamie Winship, Michael Frost, and Karen Swallow Pryor. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Andrew Root. Andrew Root is the Carrie Olson Balson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He writes and researches in areas of theology, ministry, culture, and younger generations. He's the author of more than 20 books, most recently, The Church in the Age of Secular Mysticisms. And that's the one we get into today. Because we live with an utter buffet of spiritualities and we have our choice of what we use to transform us, and because we live in an age of the self in which everything has to go through the self, we are caught in tension and have become guilt-saturated. Not because we live under the should of God's commands, but because we could have been better. We have let ourselves down, and this leads to more depression and anxiety. So we try and fix ourselves. But Andy argues another way. First of all, we talk about how memoirists are the new mystics, and they point the way to transformation. But these are 3 different ways of transformation, and that our conflicts are not just polarized in 2 directions, they are triangulated. So we get into that and more. Here's my conversation with Andrew Root. Andy, welcome back to the podcast. Your 3rd time on. I'm really excited to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. Do I get a free sub or something?
Yeah, pretty soon. I'm gonna start sending you Subway coupons. Yeah. you can have that.
I guess that dates us for those of us who remember those days where you used to get little stamps on a card at Subway.
Yeah, I know those stamps. Now everything's electronic.
I know.
Man. And I dug into your book, The Church in the Age of Secular Mysticisms. I'm really excited about maybe your final book in this series. As you say, you promise, but I don't know if you promise. We'll see if it's the final one or not. But I really loved it. It's so good.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think Baker has decided there will not be another one, but I'm kicking around this evangelism project, but it will have to maybe start a whole other series maybe, but you can see I have a problem. So,
well, it's a good problem. And I think that if you're talking about the new mystic, what does it secular mysticism looks like, it actually dovetails really well into evangelism and really help us have a conversation with people to see what they're thinking and what they're actually looking at. And how they believe that the self can really save them, but they need something outside of themselves, and they need some surrender to do it. And so before we dive into evangelism next time, let's go straight into the mystics. What is, for us, to ground us, what do you mean? What is mysticism? What are we looking at? And how can we enter into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the blurriest piece. Well, I mean, I should, I'm not just being self-deprecating, but I think, there can be a lot of blurry pieces in the stuff that I write with all these big ideas kind of colliding and things like that. But just getting a handle on kind of what mysticism is, obviously a very kind of ancient Christian perspective and just broadly, religious perspective, which is some sense of a kind of union with God, or the human agent can connect with God. What I'm really interested on in this book is how these forms of, I guess we could call it the oxymoron of being spiritual but not religious, which pops up everywhere, which is a strange kind of phenomenon in this kind of secular age that we live in, that we've talked about on this podcast and at other times, that this is not a kind of secular age that is without spirituality. It's a kind of secular age that creates all sorts of spiritualities. And what I'm really interested in is there are ways now people are kind of talking in this mystical language, that they feel like this spirituality connects them to some kind of union. But what is really fascinating is it tends to be a more union with their own self than with the very being of God. But that in itself is just, I think, a really strange phenomenon. And I think as we talk about the secular age inside of church conversations, it's easy for people to push back and be like, well, we're not that secular. We're, there are all sorts of spiritualities everywhere in this context. And I affirm that completely. I mean, we live with an utter buffet of spiritualities, but you need a kind of secular age like we have, where belief becomes contested and an option, and there's just a deep kind of sense of competition everywhere, that will create, I think, these other spiritualities and oddly spiritualities that have no real connection with kind of classic organized forms of religion or the traditions of religion that go back, thousands of years. People kind of can create these ad hoc or just, as they please.
Yeah. And because we're creating these spiritualities and we're trying to say that our self can save ourself, that we could find something other than the transcendent God that can break in and actually save us, we're finding it somewhere else. I mean, my friend just got back and she spent her time at Burning Man just recently.
Oh, yeah.
She was there as a Jesus follower and saying that there is something outside of herself other than shrooms and these mystical experiences or whatever it was that they want to try and save themselves, that there is this Holy Spirit and Jesus is there. He wants to actually break into something new. But there are so many people trying to figure out, what does it look like for us to save ourselves? How can I be saved again? What would you say to people that are curious and looking, these spiritual but not religious people?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're at one level, and I hope the book kind of communicates this, that there needs to be a certain level of respect for those people, like in a sense that they're yearning for something, they're searching for something. But there is this really interesting dynamic where, as you kind of were referencing there, they have a certain view of the self, and the idea, of course, is what might be able to. I mean, we could kind of say save ourselves and kind of instead of Christian language, but in some sense, like lead to this kind of union or make things right or lead to some kind of breakthrough that feels like, yeah, I guess just feels like union, feels like being connected to something larger, seems to overcome kind of certain levels of brokenness and impediment and things like that. That there is this deep sense that I think comes through the Western tradition, and particularly since the Enlightenment period, that says that the self has those resources within it, and that the self is perfect. And if the self could escape all these kind of traps of haters and societal lies and different things like that, that you could get back to the base kind of pure self. So it's a very high kind of anthropology, that everything is right within you except all these kind of negative messages. And this goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who really kind of had this sense that the self is kind of perfect. The self is perfectly magnificent, and all you need to do is escape all the strictures and all the kind of warped messages that come from Paris, that like come from civilization. And if you could just kind of get back to the purity of human life outside of it, that the self is really perfect. And that is a very much a flip of Augustine on his head, where Augustine, and I think the sense that goes through Western Christianity and really through, I think, biblical echoes through Pauline theology, is the sense that there's something that's fundamentally amiss within us. And that's not to be like, I think we're guarded against that because it feels like a kind of misanthropic hatred of people or something. That's not to say that necessarily. It's just to say that we need something outside of us to make things right, to save us. And of course, in the Christian tradition, sin and all sorts of things warp that. But it is a sense of like, what at the core of the self does the self need? And I think our kind of cultural anthropology is that the self is perfect the way the self is. And I think that leads to a certain kind of spirituality that ends up making the self the most important thing. And, inside the kind of Lutheran and certain Reformed theological world that I live in. I mean, to echo Luther, that Luther really thinks sin is a kind of curved in on the self. And it's just a really fascinating reality that we have a culture that actually kind of nobilizes and makes it quite a noble activity to turn in on the self. And that if you can turn in deep enough on the self, you'll actually find the resources to save the self. You'll find that the self is really filled with riches, where I think at least the Augustinian Christian traditions are like, no, you find that the self is always in poverty, but that poverty is also a gift because it opens you up to what's outside you, to the community, and most ultimately to God, and a God who comes and meets you in the very humanity of Jesus Christ.
All right. So let's set this up. So if sin is something that's curved onto the inside of us and our self, like we're looking inside constantly and we're trying to save ourselves. One of the things that you say is that memoirists now are our new mystics in this world, and they're trying to find transcendence in whatever journey that they go through, and they're inspiring stories that the self, either in one way or another, will actually be able to save us, and we can move into a new union and feel like there's some transcendence there. So how then, if we continue to be these self-imposed like saviors, what are some ways in which we're doing that to ourselves?
Yeah.
And what areas are we doing that?
Yeah, well, that's and that's what I'm trying to trace here. In you mentioned the memoir, we'll see. People can have their own opinions about this, but the memoir has become one of the most popular forms of just literary writing in the last 2 or 3 decades. Like publishers all want to publish memoirs, and I just heard an interview with Bono, who published his memoir, and he, in the very kind of self-deprecating Irish way, Bono was calling it the me-war, like in other words, it's all about me, and he was kind of being critical, like this genre just does turn you in on yourself. And it is kind of a me-war. It's all about the self. But what's fascinating about these is that the memoirist does, and in a lot of them that I read, and I read, about 60 of these just to write this book, because I was really trying to map the different roads to transformation that happen, because the memoirist is always talking about, there was something wrong and now something got right. There was some kind of road to transformation or to conversion that was kind of at play here. And I was really fascinated that a lot of them used mystical language. Like they kind of used this sense of great kind of transformation that happened, a great union with their self that occurred. But this really sits in two different real pathways. I think there's three of them ultimately at play within our world, but the two that get the most kind of traction, if you will, are these kind of spiritual pathways of heroic action, that you do something that kind of saves you, that's heroically from the inside, so it's in a kind of external transcendence that's still embedded within the self. So examples of these are kind of the exercise memoir, the person who like changes their life by learning to run a marathon, or finds that on yoga they find grace. Another one that's very related to this, which is very heroic, is the nature memoir, where someone saves their lives. There's great two memoirs that are very interesting to read, but very much in this kind of secular vein, by Rainier Wynn, who the Salt Path is one of them, and she talks about how she walked these 300 miles over 6 months on this really rugged path in the southern part of England, and it saved her. She had nowhere else to go but kind of facing nature heroically. And she even says, "I don't believe in God. I believe we're just carbon, and there's no other purpose." But when she does what she thought was impossible and walks these 300 miles and faces down the elements, she feels a sense that she's saved herself. It's back to your language about saving. So those are two. And another one is just this kind of deep sense of, I call it the vocation narrative, but we kind of have vocation echoes certain theological traditions, but this is mainly based in the self, where you discover the one thing that you're amazing at, and you conquer all to do that. So there's a great memoir called Yes, Chef, that's really about this guy who conquers all to become one of New York's greatest chefs. And there's a certain kind of moral vision in this where he's willing to burn all his boats and burn everything. Like he ends up having a child, getting a woman pregnant when he's a sous chef in Switzerland in the Alps, and he has to leave. He leaves her and he doesn't see her for like 10 years, this daughter he has, because he's trying to chase down his dream of being this great chef. And the memoir kind of justifies that. Like, if you're really going to conquer here, if you're really going to find the heroic action that will change you, you have to be willing, to give up all things for this dream. So that's one kind of trail that was really clear within this.
You hit me down in the deepest part of me about the performing self and the heroic action. I mean, it's just natural to me. Like I want to perform well. I want other people to see that I do this well. And I know that I need a different way. And I know I need to say, no, God, what do you want from me? One of the things that I was thinking of is the self-help place that we're all in right now. And especially Western Christians, because we're in this secular age and we're in late modernity. And it is something where we feel depression, anxiety, and all sorts of things. Where do you see the place for maybe psychology I mean, there are clinical things. Yes, we need to make sure that the clinical things are taken care of. But where do you see this self-help? But even in like therapists, like meeting the self, maybe life coaches, where do you see that at play? And are we just trying to save ourselves there, or are we surrendering to God in those times?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we live in an age, and I think for some good reasons, where it is really a therapeutic age. Like in the last decade, my gosh, since the pandemic, the importance of kind of psychology and really, and I guess even more than psychology, I would just say kind of a certain kind of therapeutic interventions have become really important. Some of that medication, some of that counseling, some of that, apps that can help us. I actually am all for that stuff. I do think we have to recognize that I guess one of the things I want to push is that we are in an epoch where that we are in the age of the self, if that makes sense. So everything ends up going through the self, and there's always this deep temptation that will essentially make the self divine in a certain way, or make it what philosophers will call the summa bonum, like the ultimate thing that kind of becomes the gravity that connects all other things. And so obviously that can happen in any kind of professional field. And I just think in this moment, and as someone who has a kid off at college in a junior in high school, like I'm all for psychology and counseling and things like that, and the necessity for interventions in this moment, in the way like the performative self plays, that says like your whole life is performing yourself, and if you're not getting good feedback for that, at the very least you should feel depressed, let alone just even wonder if you should be at all. Like these are really quite scary outworkings of that. But there are certain ways that we have to be careful, because those performative dynamics can also become so writ large, and they are so writ large, that they even take these good elements and suck them into themselves. Like I get, I watch Hulu all the time, and we have the commercial Hulu, and the main advertiser, and I don't know if this is the algorithm or this is everyone, but the main advertiser on these shows is Hims, which they're also now like advertising in football games too. Like, so this is this like online store where in the three things that they're really advertising, if I can get to this, is like they're advertising ED issues, hair loss, and then like therapy, the need to talk to someone about your depression. And it's just fascinating how those three things can get roped together as if they're all one and the same, And so I do want us to worry about, in this kind of therapeutic time, there is a certain way that even these at their best intentions, therapeutic outlets become completely capitalistic. You know what I mean? And especially like a kind of like hair loss and depression, as equated as the same thing, does kind of point to, this is all a kind of performance. I mean, my gosh, erectile dysfunction is all about performance. You know what I mean? So this performative dynamic all gets kind of wrapped together. And I don't think, this sounds a little odd because, someone like Sigmund Freud was kind of crazy in his own right. But Freud would never have thought like psychoanalysis, because analysis could be taken into just completely consumerist drives. You know what I mean? Like these were big stories about archetypes, and I'm thinking even of Jung here too. Like there are big narratives to play at that had deeper impact than just getting you right enough that you can go and be happy. There were larger ones than that. So I'm all for it, but some of the dynamics we just have to be really careful that they don't kind of click over and start humming this same song of the performative self, that really it's about wins and losses, and your therapist is your life coach that helps you be the best you can be,
Yeah. Yeah. And if we can move therapy, like it will usher us into a different place where we know that there's something outside of ourselves that we need. And I think that's something that, something like AA does really well for us. And, as you're tracking memoirs, one of the places, the alcoholics, they're able to hit rock bottom. And there's a transformation that can only be done outside of themselves. It can't be done on the inside. They know, like they've tried it. It doesn't work. They need something new, and they need something outside of themselves for transformation. How can we move ourselves, like through therapy or other things like AA, into a place of surrender, knowing that I need something outside of myself?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think one of the things that happens when we kind of get the commodifying or the wrapping up of even the therapeutic with, hair loss and erectile dysfunction, you know what I mean? Like what ends up happening is everything becomes a hack to perform better. And one of the things that happens particularly with an AA, so you're referencing these other memoirs. So, there are these memoirs of heroic action, but there are also these memoirs that also had a deep sense of the self, which was this kind of sense of your inner genius. You find your inner genius, and those came around romance, where like people found a spirituality around falling in love, but they ultimately kind of came down to you find your inner artist kind of, and this inner artist is who you most are, and you win affirmation for that. But in both of those sides, the kind of inner genius or the heroic action, it really is about the self winning ground for itself. But then there were these other memoirs, and they were not just memoirs of kind of, what we could call disparagingly like religious leftovers, like people like you and me who still are like deeply involved in the church and still try to make a case for certain Christian visions of the world. Like these were people who didn't grow up in a church, who didn't, weren't, in a youth group or something, but they all had a very different kind of perspective of what changed them. And what changed them was not that they found their inner genius or they found themselves heroic impulses. What they discovered is that their action could not save them. What they discovered is that the more that they tried to do the things that would get them, that would help them perform, the more they lost themselves, the more they lost kind of grip on what it meant to be human. And these really were at their core narratives of addiction. Like the addict really thinks that their actions can set them right or justify them in some way. And the move of AA, which is so beautiful, is that you have to surrender. You have to surrender to the fact that you are an alcoholic, and you have to have some kind of sense of a higher power that you now are surrendering to. And it's not very dogmatic necessarily, but it's a profound, this is one of the reasons I think AA is so profound, is up against the performative self of late modernity. It's a starkly different kind of theological anthropology. It says your actions cannot save you, and look what your actions have done. And one of the memoirs that really illustrates this was this memoir called The Recovering by an author named Jameson. And she ends up like just, she's been drinking. She's a writer. She's at the Iowa writers workshop, one of the great writing centers in America. And she just, like, you just drink when you're when you're like a MA student in lit, you just drink. And that's what all the great 20th century writers did, like Hemingway's just drunk all the time. And so if you want to be a good writer, you have to drink, because that's what supposedly gets your words out, but it also gives you these crazy experiences you write about. And she ends up in AA, and she kind of thinks to herself, though she's not really honest to herself, she kind of thinks like, well, good, now I'll be able to harvest all sorts of stories. So it's her job to, like everyone she has to give up and tell her story. She has to make a confession, as we would say in the Christian tradition, that she's an alcoholic. And so, you have to narrate that confession. So she starts telling her story, and she's very aware that she's performing, that she's giving a performance. And one of these guys in the back, one of these recovering alcoholics, yells at the top of his lungs in the middle of her presenting this story. He just blurts out, "This is boring." He just yells at the top of his lungs, "This is boring." And it shook her, and it led to this realization that he was absolutely right. Like, you can't BS a BSer. You know what I mean? Like, he knew that she was not making a confession. She was performing herself. And it did take her down this road where she realized, it's really quite fascinating, these addict memoirs, that she realized she needed to start praying. And she didn't believe any of it. She didn't feel like she could believe it, but she told these AA leaders, like, I don't believe in this. And they're like, well, chain smoking at the time, like, who cares? You just do it. And there's a sense where you surrender to prayer itself. And she finds this deep sense of restoration and healing through the confession that the self is not magnificent, that the self needs something from outside. As Luther would say, in the kind of opposition to the turned in self, that you need a foreign righteousness to meet you, that your righteousness is not buried within you, that the righteousness, though, is a free gift of grace that is outside of you, that can come and meet you if you'll surrender that you need to be ministered to by the Spirit, that you need something from outside you to claim you, to come near to you. And I think this is the kind of crux of where we're at in our cultural context, that we often say to young people, which is why they're so depressed and anxious, that you need to perform yourself, that you need to be your magnificent self. You need to find it. You need to find your inner genius. But I think there's something incredibly profound about at least the kind of Protestant Christian confession, that's to say, you need to confess and surrender to something outside of you, and search it and see what happens here, in that you are not magnificent. You are beautifully and wonderfully made, but beautifully and wonderfully made to be in relationship with others, to be encountered and ministered to by others, to be cared for by others. It's not what you do that matters. It's who comes to you and who meets you. And so there's a really profound sense of transformation that happens in those stories.
You want to be in a place of surrender and confession, knowing that something outside of ourselves can help us. I love what you put here as every conflict is not polarized, but is triangulated, because you talked about the heroic action of, people, what you would call there, we did define it, but counter-enlightenment. We talked about the inner genius that you talk about, and you call it exclusive humanists. And if you want to define those, you can. But really, if you look at it, they're opposed to each other, and so they're just arguing about themselves back and forth. And it's kind of maddening, because there's really not a solution unless there's a third way. And you say that third way are the beyonders, the ones that know that there is a transcendence that needs to inbreak into ourselves and to us, that there is God coming towards us and breaking in. Give us what those conflicts look like and how we could set those up.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting. I think it's the appropriate way to end the series, because it's really kind of picking up on a part 5 of Taylor's A Secular Age, which the whole 6 volumes have drawn on different parts of his piece. But he wants to make this argument, which I think is really quite convincing, that that we have conflicts and dilemmas that we have to deal with in modernity. And we often tend to think, and especially in the last 4.5, well, since 2016 at least, we've kind of felt like the whole world has become pluralized, that there's just two sides that are against each other. And one of the things that Taylor wants to say that I'm really quite convinced by is that one of the reasons that the arguments and conflicts and dilemmas feel just so maddening in our time is because it's not just two sides. It's actually three sides. And they're teaming up against one, and then the two are teaming up against the other. And there's a certain, a certain way that this becomes quite maddening. So people who've read my work for a while know that I'm a recovering diagramaholic. So I used to have a lot of diagrams in my writing. And then I used to read other people who were also into diagrams, and I would read their stuff and look at their diagrams and be like, this makes no sense to me whatsoever. So I went to the AA of diagramsaholic and was gave that up. Except this book, I've fallen off the wagon, and the diagram returns, and try to draw this diagram as a triangle. And there's the 3 points on this triangle are, like we said, this kind of heroic action is really connected to what we might call the counter-enlightenment people, that they really think that what freedom is being heroic. And we've seen a really revitalization of this in the American discourse, and it's particularly come from people who are more on the right side. But in the 70s and 80s, like punk was a left-wing counter-enlightenment. There in England there were certain socialist and almost even communist movements that were very, very much anti-enlightenment. So it's not just a right-left thing. This is what's kind of maddening. But they are in deadly competition against the elites, the coastal elites, which we could call the exclusive humanists. That they have this deep sense of this exclusive humanism. And those two groups really don't like each other and are often fighting against each other. But this third group Taylor calls are those of us who still believe, or we can see this in relation to religion. And he says, there's two things that those of us who still have a kind of religious disposition hold to, and it's one that we hold that there's something beyond human flourishing, that there's something more than just human flourishing. We want human beings to flourish, we want society to flourish, but we also think that we have to be loyal or even citizens of a kingdom not of this world, that there's a kingdom that is coming. So there's something more than human flourishing, and that deeply offends the exclusive humanists. Like, they don't trust people who believe that, because they think that you'll ultimately be repressive towards people's freedoms when they're trying to work out their own identities. The fact that there are certain people who believe that there's something beyond that is a problem. Well, the counter-enlightenment people don't have a problem with that. What they have a problem with is that people who believe in something, and particularly Christian people, believe that there's something beyond death, that this life is not the end, that there may be something more, that we don't know what that is, but we do believe that we live in the very life of God after death. And they think that that is just some kind of polarized, kind of edited out of all the scary parts of life, and is just it's the real opiate crisis, if you will. Religion's just a drug that's trying to put a nice patina on the harsher parts of life. And when both of those are critiquing religion, they'll team up against each other against those. But then they'll sometimes join up with religion to critique the other, and when you're someone who believes, you're kind of caught between those things, because when the exclusive humanists say, well, you don't care about people's desires, you just believe that there's something beyond it, we respond and say, no. The church is accepting. We want to be accepting of all people. We think that the church has to be welcoming. We think God embraces and loves all people. But as soon as the counter-enlightenment people hear that, they're like, oh my gosh, there it is. There it is. God is loving and hugs everyone and wants to kiss everyone. And we're like, no, you don't understand. Like, we believe there's evil in the world, and we believe that God is bringing forth justice towards evil, and we believe that the church is God's gym, and we have to be strong in this. And then the other side goes back and says, oh, there it is. See, you're repressive. You want to tell people how to live. You even will say people are evil. And you find yourself, Taylor's point, is hooked by one horn or the other in these. But it reveals that there's really a triangle going on, and you throw any issue in the middle and two will team up against one. But I think the big existential crisis for American Protestantism in the last few years is both mainline and evangelical Christianity have had a hard time claiming and keeping to our kind of beyonder position, that we've slid down the triangle, if you will, if you can visualize this as you listen to this, kind of we've slid down one side or the other. So in the last 5, 10 years, mainliners have become more like exclusive humanists, and kind of found shelter with them. And, just to be really broad, evangelicals have kind of slid down more of a counter Enlightenment kind of nationalism. And now these different forms of Protestantism see themselves as very, very different than each other and the real enemy to each other. Where when we're closer to this Beyonder path, yeah, there may be differences, but we're kind of still brothers and sisters in this, and we're still committed to. So maybe we work it out in different ways, but we're committed to these things, and so I think this is a crisis that Protestantism deals with: is that inside these dilemmas of late modernity, we've taken on this anthropology. So in two very different ways, mainline and evangelical Christianity have taken on a performative anthropology of magnificence, and we've lost this sense that there is a kind of confession of needing something from outside of us to save us, that we're yearning for something beyond, and not beyond in a kind of purely metaphysical way, but a vision of what is good that's beyond just this, and a vision of life that's beyond maybe even our death. And so, that's ultimately kind of what I'm pushing for, is us as Protestants to keep our beyonder sensibilities. And it's hard because confession and surrender sound like really scary things, and they have been used. Those kind of themes have been used to do spiritually abusive things. But they need to be, we need to care about how we negotiate and how we think about those. But we do have these examples of these people in these memoirs who find profound transformation by making a confession, by confessing their need for others to be with them, to share their lives, to confess, there's these imminent dying ones, of people who write letters to their children as they're dying, and they're unbelievably beautiful as they surrender to death and trust that something will meet them and meet their family in the midst of that sorrow. So it really is a kind of sense of God's very activity coming into these experiences. And I think the spiritual abusive ways of thinking of surrender and confession also end up performative. Like, you have to do this to perform, to be part of this church, or to be loved by, these people. And we're all kind of just caught in a kind of echo chamber of performance.
Yeah. So if we are caught in this echo chamber of performance, and if we've both mainline Christianity, evangelicalism have slid down the triangle towards these two polar opposites, how then, because I think that a lot of people, this is the water that they swim in. They're not aware that this is really happening. It's just cultural around them, and so they don't recognize it. How can we help people recognize that we've slid down the triangle and we need to get back to the surrender and confession?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really weird things that's happened here, and one of the reasons that these kind of spiritual but not religious exists, is because people feel deeply guilty. And this is a very odd thing that's happened, that, like, here we are in the first 3 decades of the 21st century, and we are an utterly guilt-saturated society. It's just that the guilt that people feel is not under the should of God's command or something. They feel guilty for what they could have done, kind of how they let themselves down. And I think one of the ways forward is for us to create spaces. I mean, this is similar to kind of my practical working out of all the themes of these books, is to create a space for people to make confessions and tell stories of the burdens they bear, and that's one. There's just something utterly profound. Like, confession is an utterly empowering reality. I think we're scared of it because we think it's like a woe is me, or a I'm awful, I'm just a worm, which is this like very anti-self-esteem kind of perspective. But it really isn't. Like, you look at profound movements of confession, like think of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Like, that movement to publicly confess led to the mutual humanity of restoration and new visions of what it means to be made in God's image, and the goodness of our neighbors, and the new possibilities that exist for a society. And so, thinking about how Christian communities create spaces, both liturgically and in their everyday life, for people to confess their sufferings, the burdens they feel under, the way they feel impinged by performance can be utterly countercultural and profoundly transformational. So creating those kind of spaces within the church where prayer and other practices become a way of confessing how easily, like, you said it yourself, and in many ways I'm doing this podcast thinking, am I performing well right now? And one of the crazy things about we're doing this on Zoom right now is it's really hard not to look at yourself and watch yourself perform for yourself. Like, there's so many ways that we're all caught in this, and you cannot muscle your way out of it. You can only hand it over to other people who will walk with you, and minister to you. The Christian life, as Jesus taught us, is not just washing other people's feet, but having your feet washed. There's this mutuality of both giving and receiving in ministry, and we need that. And we need that by saying we're the kind of creatures who need others. So practically finding ways to do that in our stories and our liturgies and our lives together become really important.
Yeah, one of the things you write in your book is you talk about transparency. And so I think some people, when they think of confession, they think, I'm being transparent, I'm burying everything, and this is going to save me. Oh, why does transparency not save us? And why does transparency not create trust in groups?
Yeah. Well, it's an important point, because this is a high good of our kind of late modern time, especially as we engage with institutions. We think we just need them to be really transparent. And towards like the last, maybe the fourth to end of the chapters, when I start to take a more direct theological kind of move away from kind of cultural analysis to engaging this. The kind of hinge point in making that turn is this very interesting German-Korean philosopher named Byung-Chul Han. And Han thinks that transparency is something we love. Like, you look at our architecture, and there's a lot of transparency in it. Like, I was just in London a few weeks ago, and the new buildings are all glass, and you can see through them. And you look at the old Victorian buildings, or and even older buildings, or you look at the old London Tower back to whatever that is, 11th, 12th century, and it has a very different ethos to it. Like, it's to keep you out, it's to give you a sense of royal rule. And our buildings are very much glass and seamless, and it's about transparency somehow. But he doesn't think transparency you can't confuse that for confession, because the way transparency is often used is as a ploy for those to bombard us with information that means that nothing really changes at all. And that what happens in full transparency is we first of all tend not to have to interpret anything. We tend not to have to wonder what's going on here. We tend not to have to find a new story to live within. And we're just bombarded with information and not a story. And we lose otherness in the midst of that. We just kind of have a transparency where we don't have a sense of really meeting a real otherness. And the kind of transcendence that I think that we want to get at, like the spiritualities of exclusive humanism and of this kind of counter-enlightenment kind of perspective, are a kind of spirituality or a kind of transcendence that are embedded in the same and inside of you, inside the self. And they don't do well with otherness, with real otherness. But the Christian confession is contingent on God being other. And the kind of mysticisms that go back to, like the 6th century and the creation of mysticisms like through pseudo-Dionysius are this deep sense of God being completely other and us communing with God as others. So the first move is to confess we cannot commune with this God. We need to be met by this God. This God needs to arrive and show up in our lives. So transparency gives us the illusion of control in many ways. And it does allow institutions and the other power brokers, you just think about how Silicon Valley does this. Like, oh yeah, you're right, we shouldn't harvest your data. So at any point you can have we're completely transparent with your data. Just send an email here and we'll send you a zip file filled with all the data we have of you. And there is no way to make any sense of all that. Like, it is so transparent, you have no idea. And their ploy, of course, is to keep all our data and do whatever they want with it by saying, here it all is, now drowned in it, and good luck with that. And now you have nothing to say as we keep it, and we know how to mobilize it to sell you products, So transparency does not necessarily lead to justice in any sense. A real encounter with otherness does that. A real encounter inside of stories and narratives where we can confess and find ourselves bound to each other through stories of brokenness and need, I think brings forth the real transformation we need.
Yeah, we need that transformation. I mean, another thing, talking about how do we get to this place of not performance of the self, but we're not just sitting and contemplating only.
Yeah.
But as the Jesuits would say, they're contemplative activists. How do we have contemplative action in our life? And can we get to that place where we're not just serving the self in our action?
Yeah, and people may have this will be interesting to see how people interact with this, because it is my take is a very Lutheran one. That we can focus more on action, which is what we tend to do as Americans. Like, we're going to do more, and we're going to at least do the right stuff, but we focus more and more on action, and that does kind of take a certain like works righteousness, for lack of a better term, that kind of permeates our whole life. But the other side of this then is the real response to a overaction or a way of action has been a way of contemplation. And there's a deep beauty within the Christian tradition, and particularly within Christian mysticism, about contemplation and what meets us in contemplation. But Luther's skeptical of this. Luther thinks that contemplation will end up being colonized by this other anthropology eventually. That eventually, just like the Romans, people of action, colonized the Greeks, people of contemplation, eventually action will overtake you in one way or another. And that you need a very different sense of what's going to occur here. So he wants a way of passivity where we actually stop to receive. And that becomes the most important piece, is to put us in a disposition of being people who received a gift. And the gift is the very body of Jesus Christ himself. That's the kind of way we want to live. And then we want to go into the world and give gifts to our neighbor, which is the gifts of our own presence, the gifts of ears willing to hear their stories of confession, of to walk with them in the midst of their senses of brokenness. So there is this kind of way of, can we think about this? But this passivity is it's a little bit like what we've talked about before about waiting. It's a waiting in anticipation. It's a waiting to receive. It's a kind of passivity that puts us in a place of I guess it's the place of receiving a gift, or hearing music, or having an artistic experience where you're very deeply active, but you're also receiving, and you're receiving something that's outside of you. And so I think, moving in those directions, I don't know. I mean, this will be what kind of, how do we make sense of this? Can we build churches and communities that are about action, but also about contemplation, but that's really set in a disposition of being people who receive a gift, people who receive others' humanity as a gift, who receive our own broken stories as a gift, who are passive in the sense when it comes to performance, that we don't need to perform, that there's no performance that can save us. And like we've said a few times here, this is in us. Like, this is, you don't just get to kind of go, well, I'm not going to perform anymore. This whole society, especially in a digitalized spaces like we're in, is just performance is everywhere. So you are going to need to walk with people who hold your life in the midst of this. You're going to need a community, and you're going to need a constant state of confessing and taking on practices of passively waiting for God's arrival. Things like Advent, and how we think about Advent becomes an important time of passivity, where we wait in the darkness of the world for the light to come. And the waiting changes us. It transforms us. It shapes our lives in a very different way. I mean, Christmas in many ways is all that anticipation of waiting to receive the gift. And the gift is the very child born of Mary, who is true God of true God.
Mm. That's beautiful. That we are passive in our receiving of the gifts of God, and that's really helpful for, I think, a lot of us, because we live in this performance age. It's really helpful to know that we're the ones that receive the gift, but we also believe, I and I probably am not the only one that believes that I'm not worthy of this gift, because really none of us are truly worthy, but we are all worthy of the gift. So it's a very hard thing for people, especially in this performance age, to get to a place of saying, am I worthy of this gift?
Yeah.
Have I done enough for this gift? What would you say to people if they believe that they're not worthy to receive the gift?
Yeah, I mean, it is something we all, I mean, we feel, we just have the hardest time dealing with disappointment or, I mean, I'm just even thinking of my own life today, like receiving an email of negative feedback that comes after receiving emails or, discourses or people reaching out, give 10 positive things. But the one thing is just like, oh, crap. How do I, you can kind of feel the crisis of failure. That's just really, really central there. And I guess what I would say to all of us, and, this would be a sermon I would preach for myself, is that what makes you worthy is the fact that you are a human being. And that isn't in some sense of like human beings, it isn't, human beings are just perfect and beautiful just the way they are. No, what makes you worthy is being a human being, because God, in the person of Jesus Christ, has taken on your humanity. So all needs to perform have been executed in Jesus Christ. And I mean kind of executed in both ways. Like he has done them all faithfully to the Father, and he has taken on all the ways that would isolate us and all the ways that would thrust death upon us, and been executed under those and overcome those. So now the fact that we just are, that we have our being with one another, makes us worthy of this. What makes us worthy of this is the very person of Jesus Christ, who is for you, who is on your side, who has put all performances to bed. And which is in many ways why, I think Paul keeps on saying, I am strong when I'm weak, when I am in the midst of kind of, this is the whole disposition of Second Corinthians is really Paul's performative failures. Like he's taken a lot of heat, and they are like, Paul, you're not that great. And you're no super apostle, and you're kind of crappy preacher. And Paul's response is not to kind of justify himself and, to kind of, haters will hate and you guys don't get it. And I'm going to work harder and, whatever. Paul's response is, remember what God is for you, crucified and pushed out of the world. So everything comes backward. When we are weak, we are strong. When we are fools, we are wise. And those are all dynamics that say you can't perform your way out of this. You can only receive the gift. And the gift is the very humanity of Jesus Christ, that is linked to your own humanity. But the uniqueness of Jesus' humanity is that he is true God, a true God, and therefore his performance becomes yours and takes you into the very life of God. And that's the kind of mysticism that I think is this deep, long Christian tradition that says through the sufferings of Christ, our sufferings are overcome and bring us into direct communion with a very Trinitarian life, that we are now free. We are free to live without performance, because Jesus Christ is with and for us.
Amen. Amen. And that was a beautiful way to end this part of the conversation. Just a couple things I'd love to say. One, Andy, this book, The Church in the Age of Secular Mysticisms, is fantastic. And so I highly recommend it. I've already, as I've read, and you talk about triangulated conflicts, and we're talking about the heroic action, we're talking about the inner genius, and you're talking about beyonders of transcendence outside of ourselves, and true otherness. And this framework, I could enter into the world, and I could see this happen all over the place, and what conflicts are. And I was teaching at a conference this on Saturday, and I was on a panel talking about is the church in decline and what that looks like, and what are the narratives that we tell ourselves. And I was able to talk about those two narratives, and the narrative of there is something beyond us. And it's been very, very helpful for me, and I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of people. And I really like your diagrams in this book, so it's good. You can feel good about your diagrams. They're really helpful. They're good.
Yeah, and as one of my friends says, I name names too, so you can check it out for that. So people get mapped on this thing that will maybe make me friends and make me not have friends. We'll see how it goes. So
That's good. One random question I have for you at the end
yeah,
is: is there a movie that has
sure.
impacted your faith?
Movie that is impacted by faith. Well, one of them that races to mind, and I feel like I should have a more up to date one. But one of the things that really got me thinking about these dynamics of what it means to kind of share in each other's lives and the transformation of that kind of mutual ministry was Good Will Hunting, like the whole kind of flow of Good Will Hunting. And we were even talking about the therapeutic that in some ways Robin Williams' character in that movie um, is very much a therapist, honors the therapeutic practice, but is more of a pastor than is really a therapist in many ways. Like he's just sharing in Will Matt Damon's life, and then we have this great transformational moment of confession and surrender that becomes deeply humanizing. So yeah, that one has always really played, and I'm at the point now where it's old enough that I can re-show it in classrooms because before, like even like 5 years ago it was like this is just old and this guy hasn't updated his movies. But then it gets past a point and it's like, hey, that's cool. We're looking at a classic film here. So it makes me feel old, but I'm happy to have it come back.
Yeah, thinking of Good
Yeah,
Will Hunting as a classic film makes me feel old too. It
I
just
know.
doesn't it feel like it just came out? Like, and
It does. And then I realized I was like, my senior year of college or something. It's like, oh my gosh.
yeah,
So
that's good. So, how can people connect with you and get your book and the rest of the Secular Age series?
yeah, I mean, probably, this is this is the performative contradiction of the performative age. Yeah, you can find my website, which is just andrewroot.org. And yeah, there's stuff there, or I don't know, in that one social media site that his name has changed so many times. I don't know if it's Twitter or X or Twitter X or whatever it is. You can find me there too, but I'm very bad at it. So even in the book itself, I make a confession of my Twitter performance. But I'm there. You can find me there, or you can find me on my website, and people can email me. It's pretty easy to find my email if they have a question.
That's good. And yeah, if you read the book, you might be really excited to go get an Airbnb somewhere, which is good. Was it an Airbnb commercial that was going through?
I do need. I feel like the Airbnb should like sponsor the book
They
release or
should sponsor
something.
the
So
book
yeah,
release. They really should.
yeah,
You're there. And it was beautiful. If you're talking about the refrain of Bon Iver and his
yeah,
Holocene song
yeah,
that I knew I was not magnificent. And
yeah,
so it was really, really nice to have Bon Iver just in my head. I was reading it over and over
yeah,
again and hearing that refrain.
yeah.
I think it was Bon Iver's was the first concert my wife and I went to together,
Oh
um,
wow,
and it was off of that album too. So
yeah,
it was very special for me
yeah,
to hear Bon Iver all the way through and
yeah,
just remind myself of my
yeah,
wife and other things. So
yeah.
that was great.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the kind of if the book has a song, if there's a soundtrack to it, that's definitely it. It's the line he says where somewhere baby, it's a part of me apart from me is the
Yeah.
kind of mystical disposition of the beyonder. And then the refrain that I think we just need to help young people and all people into is that um, there's no shame in making the confession at once I knew I was not magnificent. And yeah, it's beautiful. And another time I'll tell my story about hearing French college students, university students singing that at Rousseau's feet was really quite fascinating.
Yeah, that's good. Well, Andy, thank you so much for this conversation. I truly enjoyed it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.